So I'm Alex Coles. Well, no, I'm not, actually. Alex, unfortunately, couldn't come and be here. He was going to give a talk on Rails front ends and talking about Ember and Angular and Backbone and all that sort of stuff and how you can do that effectively in Rails. Yeah, unfortunately, I believe he fell ill or something, and so sort of last Friday, I got asked, do you want to step up and do this? I know you love the asset pipeline. Why don't you give it a go? So yeah, OK. So you'll have to excuse me. This has been a bit rushed. Hopefully, you get something valuable out of this. But anyway, so I'm Sam. I'm better known as SA26 on the internet. I'm a Ruby, JS, Go, polyglot creative. I'm going to steal that word from this morning. And SJ26 was a random assignment of letters and numbers from Hotmail when I was about 6, so it doesn't actually mean anything. Yeah, depending on who you talk to, I'm known for looking like some sort of British author, some incarnation of a British time traveler, or a very grumpy Irishman. But in the Ruby world, I'm better known for creating Mailcatcher, which is a tool for developers when you're building your apps. You want to send email, but you don't actually want to spam all your customers with that email. Perhaps you want to check out that it's looking all right in text-based stuff, it's looking all right in HTML, that sort of stuff. Anyway, it's very boring. We're here to talk about front ends. So I thought we need an example to talk about front ends. I can't just talk a bit esoterically. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to put together a concrete example, so I'm stealing one that everyone's likely to know, and it's familiar to me, given that I'm the Mailcatcher guy. I thought we would look at email. Specifically webmail. This took me way too long to get this screenshot. Have you tried running Windows 95 recently? So we'll create mail on Rails, and I'm a developer. I can't draw at all, so this was a slightly nicer version that my girlfriend was kind enough to provide. And we need some test data for this thing. So I've reached back into the 90s as well, and there was this wonderful company, sticking with the 95 sort of circa thing. Here's the company in Tron. And this is a depiction of what actually happened to the company. Now, unfortunate as this may have been to so many people, it was actually a tragedy. There was a huge court case about it and everything, and one of the good things that happened about this is all the email in the company was made public. And so some thoughtful computational linguist grabbed it all, compiled it into an archive, and put it on the internet. So you can go and grab it, and you can go to your heart's content. You can look at how terribly Outlook has made email a thing. But for my purposes, I never actually got to build an application to show you, but I will be providing an example later on, which we'll get to that later. But if you want to play with email, this is a great data set to do it. So we're going to talk conceptually about building webmail because it's an easy application that everyone's familiar with. And we're going to talk about doing it the Rails way first. So you go away, you make a Rails application, you do a little bit of modeling, you know that there's going to be an account, there's going to be some mailboxes, there's going to be some messages inside it, and it's going to probably look something like this. This is quite nice. It's from a library called Pure. It's a framework created by the Yahoo UI guys. But I just shamelessly stole one of their example layouts so that we could talk about something that we have shared together. As the first thing you're probably going to do with this in Rails is break it up into some partials. So like there's a list of mailboxes on the left, which is about the account. There's a list of messages. And there's like the actual email. And we're going to do this really stupidly. Like we're not going to worry about JavaScript yet or anything. So imagine every one of the links on this page is going to the server. It's re-rendering the whole thing, and it's sending it all back, right? And so we've got some partials in place. Now we want to actually make it look not terrible. Again, I'm a developer. I'm not a designer. I can't make things look pretty, so I go and grab some terrible library to do it for me. I say terrible. It's amazing, actually. It's great to have a common way of talking about things, and it's got so much inside it, right? So we've got a grid system, topography, code, tables, forms, etc. Drop-downs, button groups, navs. There's so much stuff in here, it's broken the topography on my slide. It's busting. And because that's huge and you don't want all of it, you can go to a page that's very nicely created, but it's huge. There are so many options, which is fantastic because you can change the colors and all that sort of stuff. But at the end, it gives you a bundle that you stick in your apps directory somewhere, and you reference that in your own stuff, and then you're delivering this huge amount of CSS to every single client that comes to your site. And and it's pretty, it's customized, whatever. And then you realize later down the track, I actually need an extra component, or that color of red isn't quite right. So you've got to come back to this giant page, and if they're nice, they've given you a URL that's got all your options in it, and you can go back and tweak it. And then you stick that great big file over the old one, and your Git history becomes a mess and all that sort of business. So we do the standard things that we all probably already do already. I am assuming that everyone is at least reasonably familiar with the asset pipeline. But there's so much stuff. And this is the file that Bootstrap uses to build it. This is a Grunt file. So if you haven't experienced the wonder of building and maintaining assets in JavaScript land yet, Grunt is the most popular tool for doing so. It's a little bit like a rake file. You can tell it, here's a list of things that I want to be able to do. You know, build the official Bootstrap compilation, build a slimmed down version, etc. But you do it all in like a big config file. So you install a couple of packages out of the JavaScript npm package manager, add some extra code, and you end up writing a giant config file, which is the most anti-Rails thing I can think of doing. We don't like config, right? We like conventions. The fortunate thing is that just this Valentine's Day, Bootstrap announced that there's an official Sass port. There's an official Sass port. There has been a Sass version for a while, but it's never been official. So this is now automatically kept in sync with the less version. Less is like Sass for JavaScript. And what this means is that being wonderful asset pipeline users that is managing all our dependencies for us, we can, instead of requiring the whole framework or having to go and custom compile up a bundle, we can just include the bits of it that we want. So this is what Bootstrap looks like in the Bootstrap Sass repository. Like, it's broken up into lots of little files for us already, which is great. And we can choose to just remove some of them, and our bundle gets smaller. And then if we want to make customizations, we can just stick it up the top, because Bootstrap has a bunch of variables, you know, so you want to change that purple to a nicer color red or a green or something. You can stick them in there, and the rest of it just follows suit. And the cool thing about this is that when you make that change to your color green, it's a tiny little Git diff. Just a nice little one that describes exactly what you're actually trying to do. And then, you can make it look totally different. Newsweek is actually using Bootstrap. That's unrecognizable, and it's a huge site. So being able to make these sorts of customizations on the fly, doing exactly what you mean to do, is really valuable for big projects, because it means you don't get a complicated history, you don't have to worry about giant bundles, etc. And then we add our own bits and pieces down the bottom, or in a separate file, conceptually, whatever. And the cool thing about this is that from Bootstrap's own example, like, the first thing everybody does is add that navbar header at the top that's fixed to the top of the document when you scroll and all that sort of business. Bootstrap's own docs say that when you add the navbar, you've got to put padding at the top of the body. And they give you an actual number of pixels. I think it says 50 pixels, and then it actually uses 70 pixels. So even the Bootstrap docs are confused about this. But because we've included Bootstrap with all of its variables and everything available, we can just put the variable in instead. And the cool thing about this is that if I want to extend Bootstrap, if I want to build my own module or have the padding make sure that it fits in with the rest of the bits that are already in the framework, I can use their internal variables to do all that stuff. And if anything changes in Bootstrap, so does my app. Yay! So coming back to our example, we've now got a nice interface built up, right? It's pretty, it's using extensible CSS, it's maintainable. And again, you can get all this stuff done in JavaScript if you wanted to with Grunt and less and all that sort of business. But I still think the Rails way is quite nice. You can just drop the files into a directory and you add your require statements, and it all follows suit quite nicely. But can you imagine going to this thing and clicking on a link and having the whole thing re-render every single time you click a thing? It's not really a great experience. So we end up having to use JavaScript. I have mixed feelings about JavaScript. I think it's fantastic in that we can do amazing rich things on the browser. I also kind of agree that I'd rather be writing Ruby, but we have to write JavaScript. So the first thing that people do when they write JavaScript in their Rails project is stick a file like this in application.js that references a whole bunch of jQuery plugins, and then like a year into the project, you discover that actually you're not using 4 or 5 of those anymore, and there's a whole bunch of extras that have just been littered around the place, and it becomes all antiquated and horrible, and so you've got this amazing bloat within these files. And if I send you away from this with one idea, it's that this is not the right way to do dependencies in JavaScript, and you're selling yourself short with the Rails asset pipeline, because most of the power of the asset pipeline is dependency management. So instead of this, let's say we have an application.js, right? And because we want to have a maintainable code base, we've got like a messages controller that's controlling that list of messages. So we make a messages name or file, whatever. And inside that, there are a couple of templates that we're rendering that use this JavaScript. So we've got an index.js, for instance. And that index.js is where you put the requirement on jQuery, because that's initializing something about that index, right? So we don't put the require in the application.js, we put it in the index.js. And now Sprockets knows that we have a little dependency graph. And so it can make sure that when it stitches together your bundle, the right dependencies fall into the right places. So say we've got a composed view as well, we've got a new view, and that requires on like a jQuery text area grower or something, which itself depends on jQuery. When we come along and decide that index.js, well, it doesn't actually need any JavaScript behavior, let's get rid of that. You've still got the dependency chain that Sprockets understands, and it makes sure that jQuery.js is still included into your application.js bundle, right? But the more interesting thing comes when a year down the track something gets changed and you get rid of this new page, or you get rid of the dependency on the auto grower or change the way that that works, and suddenly you've got no dependency on jQuery, it just falls out of the bundle. It's just gone. So it's still in your file tree or whatever, but it's out of your asset bundle. So your browsers are no longer getting a whole bunch of code that they didn't need. And this is why I think it's great. You've got granular dependencies. Granular dependencies that mean that you don't have to worry about where in particular these things are falling and that you're delivering huge bunches of assets out to clients that don't need them. You're assured to be only requiring the bits and pieces that you need to render the views that are actually in your app. Okay, let's come back to the webmail interface. And so now we've dropped in like PJAX or turbolinks or something, which has made those refreshes happen dynamically. The HTML is still being rendered on the server side, but it's slotting into the right places, and it's a little bit quicker because it's not having to redraw the entire page every time. And so we've basically achieved the Rails way of doing something like this, right? We've decorated things with a bit of user.js, and we've made sure that our asset bundles are going to be fairly slim. Yay, business. I just want to take a side note and say that content-aware fill is my new favorite thing, because it does really weird stuff with meme images. Like, I thought this was this guy's leg up here. It's not. Back to webmail. So somebody's decided that they want to do some richer stuff with webmail. Maybe there's going to be some sort of auto-completing thing or whatever. You want models on the front end, and you want to be able to manipulate those models and be able to persist that information back to the back end, and we don't want to be rendering HTML on the back end at all, right? So we go and grab something like Backbone. So now we need to model this thing out in Backbone instead. So it probably turns into a bunch of models, a bunch of collections, a bunch of views. And the traditional approach, again, is sticking in an application.js with a bunch of folders that just requires everything down a tree or whatever, which creates a giant application bundle. And you've still got the dependencies at the top being included, like jQuery and Backbone. But the problem is, if you go and delete one of the views, say one of your Rails views that was going to be using this JavaScript, or you delete part of the Backbone app that's going to be using this JavaScript, all that old stuff is still being included in your app. It's still in the bundle. It's still gigantic. So instead, what I reckon you should do is each of these little granular dependency files should be requiring the other little granular dependency files. And that way, when you delete one of the views up here, like if we deleted mailboxes views, then the mailboxes collection would just disappear, and the mailbox.js would probably disappear as well. It'd all fall out, and you'd get a much slimmer bundle. And this is just like you require Ruby files. if you have a bunch of Ruby objects that are all interdependent, you want to be granularly specifying that, hey, this Ruby model requires this little library over here, and this Ruby library requires that library and stuff, so that you don't have a Ruby VM that just gets bloated with all of this stuff you don't need. The same stuff should apply for assets. And that's the power, I think, of sprockets. And then I tend to take this a step further. We did this on a really big app recently, where each of the pages that you have that has some sort of dynamic behavior gets its own JavaScript file. And then from that, you can granularly depend on the explicit views that it needs. Those views depend on the explicit models and collections that it needs. And when you delete one of those pages, you can delete the JavaScript here, and all of the dependent stuff that is no longer required doesn't get bundled in, doesn't get delivered to the browser, gets quicker, more maintainable. And now we get onto pre-processing. So we talk about Backbone and creating models and views and controllers, well, not controllers, in Backbone collections and stuff. But when you have a view, you need to bind it to the DOM. And at the moment, maybe we're just wrapping up some HTML that we've already rendered in Rails and then delivered to our clients and added a bit of behavior over the top. Instead, we can render that in the client side using something like some sort of templates, like you might just create a string and then substitute some stuff in, but that sucks. So we want to use template files. And there's a really cool solution from 37 Signals that they went on and on about called embedded Coffeescript. And the neat thing about embedded Coffeescript is that rather than having strings inside your Backbone views, you can pull them into a separate file, like a .eco file, and ECO takes care of turning that into a function and then just putting it into your asset bundle. And that function just gives you back the string of the HTML that you want to constitute. I can't go into these concepts enough in the time we have here because there's so much to go into, but if you are putting HTML strings into your Backbone views, that's not a good idea. Extract them out. And your JavaScript could just go and grab these files off the server and turn them into some sort of function, but that takes a lot of power, and I don't want to be doing that on every single client, so I can pre-process that on the server using Sprockets, the asset pipeline, and not have to worry about that. Like, it just creates this tiny little bundle. Like, it's all about trying to optimize the bundle that we're giving to clients to use on the front end. My favorite is actually one called Skim, right? Which is a lot like the Slim templating language. Again, it does that whole pre-processing process to get in. But so that's all well and good, being able to pull out these little dependencies and have them map correctly and make sure that only the stuff that we require is in the right bundle, right? But say now we've built our webmail interface and we want to add an admin section, okay? And so that this guy can go and delete people if he wants to. So we add an admin.js, and we require jQuery. And in your admin, I'm assuming that you've still got your require of application.js, right? But now you've included jQuery twice, which isn't great. And nobody's actually going to do this, right? But if you do the granular dependency management that I was trying to advocate earlier, then your require jQueries are littered throughout your code base, and so your admin.js is going to think that it needs to include jQuery.js still. But there's actually a feature little known in Sprockets called stub. Presume that this toe had been stubbed. We can stub the application.js from our admin.js, and suddenly it understands that everything inside the application.js is already loaded by the time that admin.js is stuck in your browser. Yay! Now the toe is skinny. So that's Sprockets' way of doing requirements and dependencies granularly. JavaScript advocates have started coming up with AMD, asynchronous module definitions, which is usually embodied by the require.js library. People are going nuts about it because it does all the same sort of thing. You can specify the dependencies that each bit of code requires in the code itself, like next to the code that's being run, and it will stitch everything up for you and make sure that only the right stuff gets delivered in the right places. If you want to use this from Rails and you feel like you can't, that's not true. Somebody's integrated it with Rails as well. So you can use the power of Sprockets knowing your dependency graph and making sure that it builds only the right sort of bundles and combine that with a require.js approach if you want to. There's another method for doing asynchronous module definition called Commonjs. It's kind of the same rough idea. And again, somebody's integrated it with Sprockets. So this is by Alex McCaw, MacMan, on GitHub. And there's a really good example of it as well. It's an app called Monocle, which is basically just a Hacker News clone. But the source is all online. So you can go and check it out. If you haven't seen a big app that does dependency management well with JavaScript, I highly recommend taking a look at this one. So now our application is going to be a bit speedier because we're using Backbone and we've got all the models client side and we can do all that sort of stuff. So we're on skates now. And content-aware fill does wonderful things to this picture. It just puts periods everywhere, and there's even a roller skate for good measure. But we're interested in more modern frameworks. Like, we want to know how to build stuff with Angular or Ember. So I'm going to talk about Angular because it's all the rage at the moment. Everyone's going nuts about Angular. And sure, things are slightly different in Angular land, but it's actually still just a few pieces talking to each other on the front end. And you're going to end up structuring it file-wise approximately the same. You're going to have a bunch of models, you're going to have a bunch of views, and then there's going to be some modules and stuff that will stitch it all together. Like, the names of the components themselves are a little bit different, but it's the same concept. Like, if you make individual little JavaScript files that contain each of these components, make sure that they reference each other's dependencies really explicitly, then your bundles are going to be nice and slim. And your client-side front end is going to be optimized. Like, you're not going to have to deliver all of this stuff that nobody needs all the time. Now, there's a few little hiccups that everybody hits with Angular. The one that I particularly don't like is there's this wonderful injection syntax. So Angular insists on doing injection for you, which is great when you want to be able to test things in isolation. But the problem is it does this by sniffing the arguments in a function and looking at the names of those arguments, figuring out how to constitute one of those things and then pass it in. So it needs to know the names of those arguments, and that sort of inflection is not necessarily available in things like IE, like old IE. So you end up having to do this clumsy syntax where you wrap it in an array and you end up repeating all of the variable names at least twice. And the Angular guys thought, well, this isn't a great idea, so let's make a compiler. And they did. It's called ngmin. It's quite neat. Does all the same sort of minification stuff as well, but it'll do things like this. It'll stick that array around that function call for you and make sure that your package ends up being browser compatible. And everyone went, oh no, now I can't use the Rails asset pipeline with it. Well, maybe not everyone, but some of us. And so somebody stepped in and made ngmin Rails. So that problem has already been fixed in the Rails asset pipeline as well. My point with this is all of the tools that JavaScript people often say, you can only use this from JavaScript. That's not true. You can actually just stitch them into the pipeline and use them where you natively want to use them. Again, with Backbone, we had embedded Coffeescript templates and Skim templates. Angular has its own templating system, and again, it requires a pre-compilation step, and somebody's written a gem for that too. This is actually quite neat. It just grabs all of the Angular files, if you name them correctly, stitches them together, and makes functions available that you can call to constitute Angular templates again. Yeah, and that's ultimately building Angular apps with Rails. It's exactly the same. You've just got a bunch of components. If you make your dependencies nice and granular, your bundles will be stitched up nice and quickly, and you can stay with the tools that you're familiar with. I don't know what this contraption is, but I guess it might be faster than roller skates. It's self-powered, and content-aware fill, again, does wonderful things. So I am sorry that I've kind of just thrown a whole lot of information at you. I just wanted to give you a few points of references to go and start looking at cool things that you can do with the asset pipeline instead of worrying about, are you able to do things with the asset pipeline? Because you definitely can. This is the only slide I had with bullet points. But it's not reasons to use sprockets, it's reasons that I like sprockets. And the prime reason is that it makes dependency management easy. It makes sure that you can have staged asset bundles so you can segment your apps and make sure you're not delivering a whole bunch of stuff to people that don't need it. And I still think it's the best tool for doing that. It doesn't require big unwieldy config files. You can just stick a bunch of files into a directory structure and they'll stitch together nicely. It's like make for assets. Now, there were some issues earlier in Sprocket's history where everyone got upset because it didn't cache things properly. It took forever to compile. These issues are gone. It's fantastic at caching these days. If you change an asset, it will make sure that all of the things that require that asset have also been updated and changed and the caches have been expired. Like, it takes care of all of that for you. And that also means that it's fast because it's not recompiling all of your assets all the time. It's only recompiling the bits that have changed. And this is something that I don't think even Grunt and Gulp and things do, or at least don't do well, and definitely not by default. The real power of it is in the pre-processing nature that I'm assuming everyone is already familiar with, because we know about Sass, we know about Coffeescript, and being able to pre-process those assets and deliver them to the browser is one of the core and most powerful functions of Sprockets. No unwieldy config files. You don't have to worry about big grunt files, big gulp files, or whatever. You just stick files in the way that you're used to, and everybody, again, I think is familiar with this. And it's built into Rails. It's where we need it, and it stays in Ruby land. Like, I don't want to be writing all these tools in JavaScript. I just want to use the language that is expressive and works. This is why I think Sprockets is still funky. Content-aware fill does this picture justice, which is nice. And again, I'm sorry, it's been a whirlwind tour. If you would like to talk about this more, so perhaps I can explain things more cogently with specific examples, come hit me up, find me on Twitter or whatever. I'd love to go through this a bit more. I will be posting some examples as well. I'd like to post the proper webmail example looking at doing things the Rails way, doing things an Angular way, doing things a Backbone way, because I feel it's very difficult to talk about this stuff without specific examples. But I hope I've dropped a few crumbs that you can go and look at, and yeah, thanks very much.
Awesome, thank you very much, Sam. Do we have some questions? We've got a little bit of time. Oh, we've got one down here.
Thanks, Sam. That's a good talk. This is more of a comment that you mentioned right at the end about how Sprockets caches things. It also has different caching mechanisms. So if you're deploying to Heroku, you can cache with memcache.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So recently, people realized that because Sprockets does its caching inside the temp directory, when you push to Heroku, the temp directory is just blown away every time. And so somebody had the bright idea of using memcache. I think it was actually Alex McCaw. And that way it would persist between slug compilations. This is actually no longer true. Heroku have figured this out, and they persist the temp cache Sprockets directory now for you. So that's what I mean by the caching problems have largely been solved because people have realized this and built in better support for it. Specifically with the Heroku example, it's taken care of for you.
Great. Do we have any more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, Sam.